thought it might be a good idea for us to start off by some element of further contextualization, as it were. Instead of going into the nitty-gritties of CRZ and the RRZ and the AIA, I thought it would be valuable for us once again to sort of look at the larger context. And I'm essentially going to talk about two sort of broad and global sort of challenges that we are confronted with. And in today's context, where there is so much of specialized knowledge that is available, one increasingly finds that where you stand on an issue really depends on where you sit. So if you are sitting as a scientist, your position may be something. If you are somebody who represents the industry, your position would be something else. If you are within the government, but within a specific department, your position would be different. And I think we had that debate yesterday, where different people from different departments had varying perspectives. So I think we need to recognize this, that yesterday there was a lot of sort of people alluded to activists. And yes, I think when you say somebody is an activist, either that person represents the global environment or the local environment, or represents people who are not necessarily able to voice their positions within any of the formal kind of systems. So yes, I think there's a need to recognize that we approach the idea of EIA, CRZ, RRZ from very, very different perspectives. Now, why this becomes important is the objectives and reference points of one's perspective really varies. And I think it was very useful to have Professor Shyam Asolekar reminding us that at the end of the day, we really need to sort of look at the reference point, which is the Constitution of India, where we are committed to, as a country, you need to be committed to the well-being of its citizens. And we also recognize that, so let's not forget that you are not looking at environment in isolation. You're, at the end of the day, looking at issues of sustainability of both people and the planet. So I think it was useful to at least look at the Constitution of India to say that this is where our unifying principles or values should flow from. The second point is that the truth is that we live in an imperfect and an unfair and an unjust world. And how do we grapple with some of these questions? And are we committed to addressing the issues of justice, whether it be social justice or environmental justice? And where do we position our discussion on CRZ, on EIAs, in the broader context of justice? I think that's equally important. If we look at history, we find that what we have done in the name of development since 1950s, end of Second World War, leaves much to be desired. We recognize today that sustainable development, though we like to use the word because it seems like a catch-all phrase, has remained a rhetoric. And it really has remained rhetoric because in the name of development, we proclaim that we are doing something, but we are actually doing something else. And I think if we very quickly look at where are we today and what is the evidence for this so-called development, and I kind of say that it is absolutely flawed developmental process. So in the name of, when we invoke development, what have we actually done? All of you, I think most of you are environmental specialists, but I think it's important for us to quickly remind ourselves that there's serious ecological stress caused by species extinction. We are losing biodiversity at a pace which is unprecedented, and it's a cause of serious concern. This is something I hope all people who do environmental sciences are aware of. The pressure on biodiversity has caused is caused essentially due to 5 principal pressures: habitat loss and degradation, climate change. Now, climate change in very many ways is going to be a game changer with regard to our development discourse. I think climate change is pushing all of us to rethink development, rethink our policies, rethink the way it's really challenging business as usual. And if you're located in an industry, the drive and the kinds of resources that large industries are putting in to say that their businesses are sustainable, or how do they measure up to sustainability parameters, is huge. You know, there is, I think this is really an indicator that we no longer look at the planet as limitless resources that can regenerate and we can do as we please. Okay. Overexploitation is a reality, and unsustainable use is also a reality. Within all of this, invasive alien species is also creating its own pressure on biodiversity. All right, along with this, we have to grapple with the fact that there is a population growth where a large part of this growth is happening in the Asia and Pacific region, and I mean, India is equally sort of affected by this. I'm going to be looking, therefore, also at issues of urbanization, because yesterday we did talk about slums and so on. So I'm using these two, loss of biodiversity, the whole challenge of population, slums, and vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities that we are creating with regard to people. So yes, population is growing at a very, very rapid pace. Now, the IPCC has identified the Asian megadeltas amongst the 4 most vulnerable areas in the world. And we need to take cognizance of this, and it is from this perspective that our CRZ, RRZ, EIAs, all these various regulations and tools become extremely critical. So are we aware of the larger processes rather than look at EIA as a tool or a process that you're applying to a specific project? I think that's what I'm trying to invoke here. Climate change variability and extreme events. In fact, in the US, what the US is going through is another example of extreme events, are 2 major elements which will impact water resources, water cycles, the ecosystems, the coasts, our oceans, agriculture, on which our survival and livelihoods of people. I mean, we need to eat, so somebody has to be, doing agriculture, producing food. So it's from both perspectives, your food supply, human life, energy. All of these are going to be impacted very seriously by both climate change and by extreme events, climatic events, and natural disasters. IPCC also says that fast developing countries like India and China lack the adaptive capacities and hence are most vulnerable. We are vulnerable, whether we like it or not. So I think this business as usual, and to say that we need to look at maybe a certain limited time frame, I think we really need to take a look at a long-term time frame. I mean, we can't sort of be complacent about saying that we just look at for the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. We really need to look at we need to take a longer-term perspective. In all of this, the poor and the disadvantaged people are especially vulnerable to adverse impacts of climate change. This is another aspect that we need to take cognizance of. With regard to Cyclone Philene, we actually say that, well, we did very well, the NDMA takes credit, the NDRF takes credit, Orissa government takes credit, that very few lives were lost. But if you go there today, there is a serious livelihood distress, and the way processes operate, I mean, the way economics operates, the way World Bank operates, the way politics operates, the kind of money that should have flown in that should have come into Orissa after the cyclone to work on livelihood issues has not happened. I mean, it's really not happened, and it's extremely distressing to see the condition of people because they really don't know what to do. So I think our ability to bounce back post-disaster or post-extreme climatic event is a matter of serious concern. So people are saying that right now you have people dying maybe of malnutrition and not having enough money for health care. So do we not look at any of these elements as part of the disaster process? So while we were able to save lives, so it's something to do with our mindsets and the perspective with which we approach a given phenomena, and that's something that we need to take cognizance of. Okay, if we look at global trends, we know that disasters are increasing. And this is an established fact. I don't think anybody is challenging this. There was a time, yes, where people said climate change is bakwas, but today it is well recognized that it is happening. So, so similarly, disaster events are on the rise. Maybe we are able to save lives. Deaths due to disasters is decreasing, but disasters are going to hit us, and we need to take that on board with regard to our developmental processes, the decisions that we make, the sites where we locate our projects. I think we need to take cognizance of each of those. I want to talk a little bit about urbanization simply because there was this whole discussion about slums yesterday, and I think the concerns are valid. But I think how do we approach? What are the policies that will deliver? That's our challenge today. We are going to be 70% of the world's population is going to be living in cities by 2050. So migration to cities is going to increase. And the fundamental question is, are our cities ready for people to be moving in? So where is the planning process which says that this is the region, this is the area where we are going to house migrants? And if people are going to be, if we are talking about affordable housing, we need to address issues of land, which is a scarce resource. We need to address issues of the money that is being made and the pricing policy of everything, and particularly of land. I don't know if you've heard about this, but I hear this unconfirmed reports that between all the politicians, it seems if you look at the Mumbai-Delhi corridor, on either side of the highway, large tracts of lands have been bought off by the politicians of each of the states. So I don't know how far this is true, but this is futuristic planning by people. So, and I think we need to sort of take note of these aspects, because like somebody was saying, unless you bring people into this room or into this dialogue, people who take decisions, we are probably, sort of looking or trying to address the problem from our perspective, which at some level may appear pristine. The messy world of political decision-making is what we need to enter into. Okay, just a quick sort of going over the fact that urbanization is going to be sort of rapid. So 50% of people would live in cities. A lot of these cities are located along the coast, which is why the contestation regarding where should we house people. So I think it's important for us not to just look at it from a department's perspective and say, where do we locate all these people? Yeah, we need to look at policies of where do we site offices, what is the kind of infrastructure that we are developing, and so on. Okay, cities also witness serious levels of deprivation. And this is something that we all are very aware of. If you live in a city like Mumbai, the number of slums, unacceptable. We know that this is not just in India, but also in other parts of the world. And it is said that slum population will reach 1.4 billion by the year 2020 across the globe. Now, these are just quick visuals for those of us who probably work in offices and don't necessarily see slums on an everyday basis, or we whiz past it because we are driving past it. We have a city that is divided, and I think somebody is answerable here with regard to the state of affairs. How is this happening? I mean, where are the planners? Where are all the departments? And it makes me really sort of wonder when people say that, there is an element of practicality. You're told practically this is not possible, or you're told that it is very expensive. Where is the money for it? I think the city has a lot of money, the country has a lot of money, and it's just a matter of being able to look at the political will and put processes in place which will make certain things happen. Yes, that political will is what we need to definitely address. And this whole divisiveness of any city is a matter of concern. It could also, this divisiveness is also possible in a small town, in villages, and it's actually tearing apart the fundamental social fabric. So the environmental decisions, the policy, and the pricing decisions that we take is actually creating processes. The outcomes, if it's going to lead to serious fragmentation of society, we need to be concerned about it from a broader perspective. So what's happening to levels of inequality is a matter of concern. And we can't say that environmentalists have nothing to do with inequality, because it has everything to do with resources, access to resources, and how we price those resources. Okay, I think with regard to the reason why I'm just giving dams as another example, yes, there are lots and lots of advantages of large dams. But the World Commission on Dams tells us that of the claims made by large dams, they looked at, I think, about 4,000 different dams across the globe. They find that most dams are operating at 5 to 50% efficiency. So we really need to, look at the claims that we make, that this is what will happen and this is what will happen, these are the benefits. The kinds of benefits that you actually see are not borne out in practice. So I think today we seriously are concerned about the claims made by project proponents. So when projects are being passed, there are huge claims being made. How far are they actually borne out? So the whole cost-benefit analysis, and yesterday there was a talk, there was mention to this, about this, that why should we be presenting elements of cost-benefit analysis? Yes, because there is a certain resource that you are claiming from the government, which is a public resource, and that resource has to be, is being given at a certain price. So I think we need to definitely look at the issue of cost-benefit analysis, and after this was another question that was raised, who is actually checking after the project has come up, what is the impact? Is it borne out by, are the claims borne out? And if not, should there be penalty clauses? That's the question. But we don't necessarily go back to some of these things. But I think the country is getting smarter. We are using technology for a whole range of things. And I think the pressure is only going to rise. So for all the project proponents, we really need to connect to some of these larger processes. And while it is true that willfully people are not going to be submitting themselves to a certain kind of audit, we must do it right, all this is fine. But the bottom line as far as industry is concerned is profit. The industry exists in order, a fellow, if he can't get an EIA clearance, he's likely to lose his job. That's the reality. So that's his existential reality, that he has to get an EIA cleared. So how much money are we willing to put in? Can an EIA specialist recommend that, relocate this whole industry, or an environmental officer who's located in a particular industry, can he say that, no, don't do this? No, the decision to do something has already been taken at a certain level. So the whole debate currently with regard to the Mundra region, for instance, I think things have happened. Okay, so a quick and a final sort of reminder of the fact that there are serious levels of vulnerability, and all of this is happening in our backyards, wherever we go. Every 5 seconds, a child dies because he or she is hungry. Every 5 seconds. These are FAO, State of Food Security data. So when in the country, when you have people who say, oh, this is going to cost, the food security bill is going to cost X amount to the exchequer, yeah, it is going to cost. Because we have done a lot of harm and we have not got our development right. It is unacceptable in this country to have children dying of malnutrition. We are a food self-sufficient country, and this is what we owe the citizens of this country. Undernutrition in children under the age of 18 affects an estimated 350 to 400 million children. More than 70% of the world's 146 million underweight children under age of 5 live in just 10 countries, with more than 50% located in South Asia alone. So there is cause for concern, you know. So the world that we live in is getting highly inequitable as well. 524 million of the world's hungry live in South Asia, more than the population of Australia and USA. What is the world we are living in, and how has this come about? 60% of chronically hungry people are women. The number of chronically hungry people worldwide is growing by an average of 4 million per year at current trends. So it wouldn't be fair on our part to say that, well, that's just a small pocket of, you know, maybe few villages, few people, few households living along the banks of a certain river who will be affected. They'll find something else to do. They will do whatever needs to be done. So displacement, migration, distress migration is being caused by a lot of development that, amongst other things, that's gone wrong. So I think some of these questions I want to sort of conclude with. What drives this form of development? And all of us are embedded in this process. Are these local, regional, national, or international forces? And we love, you know, I think in the industry circles and in the academic circles, we love to quote international examples. And we say that, well, if they could do it, why can't we do it? But we don't necessarily look at social parameters of those countries. Okay, so particularly important when we are speaking of people, communities, and their livelihoods. What is the extent of control that people have, particularly vulnerable people, over their economic destinies is a question that we need to seriously ask. We can't say that, well, they have to forego this, that, and the other. You know, there's a classic example about how when one of the flyovers was being built, Maneka Gandhi's house was sort of going to be affected. And the project proponents were asked to change the entire alignment because her house she couldn't be displaced. But we don't think of, I mean, they are politically powerful. There are others who are voiceless. So I think there is a certain inequity with which we approach our projects. And I think we need to recognize that CRZ and EIAs are embedded within these sort of national, global, and macro processes. And finally, I just want to flash this little sort of quote from Will Durant, who who's written The Story of Philosophy in 1926. And he's arguing that what today remains is the scientific specialist who knows more and more about less and less, and the philosophical spectator who knew less and less about more and more. So this is our state. We are getting super specialized, and we are really missing the forest for the wood. You know, I mean, that's our reality, that we stop looking at some of the global processes because we are so sort of narrowly looking at CRZs and EIAs and RRZs. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for your patience.